In order to prove Islam's validity and the Quran's divinity, there are a large myriad of videos, books, and websites about the Quran's so-called scientific claims. In this short video, accessible by typing the title "Water Cycle in the Quran" within the search box, a well-known Muslim apologist makes the claim that the Quran apparently accurately predicts the water cycle. Please feel free to view this short video to hear his claims. In the video, as proof of his claim, he cites a multitude of Quranic verses in quick succession without really explaining any of them. He cites the following as evidence of the water cycle in the Quran. Please pause the video to read them. Here are more verses he cites in the video. And even more. Taken from the NASA Earth Observatory website, here is an image of the water cycle, courtesy of the National Weather Service. The link is in the description. It shows the key steps of the water cycle: evaporation, condensation, precipitation, transportation, sublimation, infiltration, percolation, and transpiration. Notice the Quranic verses was silent on the description of the main steps of the water cycle. In fact, the Quranic descriptions were general in nature. In reality, they are no more than an observable phenomenon that most people knew anyway. In other words, there is not anything miraculous about them. The mention of rain from the clouds and how it is life-giving is not enough proof that the Quran is the word of God. The occurrence of rain from the clouds is sensed and detected even by animals, such as cats, dogs, birds, including insects. The ancient Egyptians and Sumerians worshipped deities related to rain and clouds, and they knew about the connection between the two long before the Quran ever claims it does. For example, equipped with this knowledge, the Sumerians and Egyptians built the world's first irrigation systems. In ancient Greece, Greek playwright Aristophanes, in his aptly named play called The Clouds, produced in 423 BCE, asks himself the following rhetorical question: have you ever seen it rain when a cloud wasn't in the sky? There are passages in the Bible, written hundreds of years before the Quran, that contain more detailed and accurate information about the water cycle than the Quran. That said, Jewish and Christian apologists do not flood the internet with a claim that the Bible is a scientific book, or feel the need to validate their book or their religion by producing never-ending articles, videos, pamphlets, and books on how it is proof of its divinity. For example, in the Book of Kings, specifically in 1 Kings 18:44, it makes the connection between clouds and rain when it says, "And it came to pass at the 7th time that he said, Behold, there arises a little cloud out of the sea, like a man's hand. And he said, Go up, say unto Ahab, Prepare thy chariot, and get thee down, that the rain stop thee not." In Ecclesiastes 11:3 it says, "If the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth." Hebrew scholars knew about the cyclical nature of the water cycle and observed the process of infiltration, in that even though the rivers ran into the sea never became full. So in this passage in Ecclesiastes 1:6-7, it describes the water cycle in more detail than the Quran. The wind goes towards the south and turns about unto the north. It whirls about continually, and the wind returns again according to its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. In addition, the prophet Amos, who is quoted in the chapter named after him in chapter 5, verse 8, describes percolation, in that water comes from the sea and is poured out on the earth. It says, "He who made the Pleiades and Orion, who turns midnight into dawn and darkens day into night, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land, the Lord is his name." Dated between 6th to 4th century BC, in the biblical book of Job, in chapter 36, verses 27 to 28, there is a description of precipitation and evaporation, which are the other key components of the water cycle. For example, it says, "For he makes small the drops of water, they pour down rain according to the vapour thereof, which the clouds do drop and distill upon man abundantly." In Job 26:8 it says, "He wraps up the waters in his clouds, and the cloud does not burst under them." Storage is a part of the water cycle, in that most of the water in the ground comes from precipitation that infiltrates downward from the land surface. It says in Psalm 33:7, "He gathers the waters of the sea into jars. He puts the deep into storehouses." And in Psalm 135:7, "He makes clouds rise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning with the rain and brings out the wind from his storehouses." The water cycle is also found in Isaiah 55:10, written around 700 BC. "For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there without watering the earth, and making it produce and sprout, and providing seed to the sower and bread to the eater." By roughly 500 BC, that is over 1,000 years before the emergence of Islam, Greek scholars were already speculating that much of the water in rivers can be attributed to rain, and had a good understanding of the water cycle. Examples of some of the thinkers included Anaximander and Xenophanes, Anaxagoras and Diogenes. For example, in the academic research paper titled "Logical and Illogical Exegesis of Hydrometeorological Phenomena in Ancient Greece," about Anaximander on page 4, it says, "He understood the relationship of rainfall and evaporation." Then it quotes him by saying, "Rains are generated from the evaporation that is sent up from the earth toward under the sun." About Anaxagoras on page 5 it says, "As a natural philosopher and founder of experimental research, he clarified the concept of the hydrological cycle and studied various meteorological phenomena, generally accepting and completing the explanation of Anaximenes. Specifically, he considered that the differences in the air density caused by the solar heat were responsible for the creation of winds." Both Plato and his student Aristotle made many scientific statements about the water cycle that are true today, from percolation, evaporation, and condensation. For example, cited in the book by Kelly Roscoe called "Aristotle, the Father of Logic," it states Aristotle correctly hypothesized that the sun played a role in the water cycle. For example, in his book Meteorology, he wrote, "By its agency, the finest and sweetest water is every day carried up, and is dissolved into vapour, and rises to the upper regions, where it is condensed again by the cold and so returns to the earth. Another book pictured here is Dr. Ian Strangeway's book called Precipitation, Theory, Measurement and Distribution. On pages 7 to 10, it mentions Aristotle believed the clouds were composed of cooled and condensed water vapor. For example, on page 9 it says Aristotle knew rain was produced in the clouds when he says the heat in the clouds rises to get free from the clouds, while the cold in the vapor opposes the heat driving the two apart. The cold then presses the particles of the cloud together, combining them into drops, and since water naturally moves downwards, the rain falls. Dr. Ian Strangeways says on the same page about Aristotle, quote, had some insight that clouds were composed of water, for he states that the sun's heat evaporates water at the surface, and this rises. When the heat which caused it to rise is lost, the vapor cools and condenses, turning from air into water. Having become water, it then falls again onto the earth as rain. In a devotional Hindu hymn to the sun god, within an epic dated to the 4th century BC, it alludes to evaporation and precipitation. For example, in the 22nd verse it mentions that the sun heats up water and sends it down as rain. Ancient Chinese scholars also contributed in the field of hydrology, as explained on page 4 of the book called The Basis of Civilization, Water Science. So in conclusion, in order to prove Islam's validity and the Quran's divinity, there are a huge myriad of videos, books and websites about the Quran's so-called scientific claims made by Muslim apologists. In reality, these verses are descriptive, general statements that can be made by anyone observing the world around them. The verses do not contain new scientific insight or explain the specific terms related to the water cycle, nor anything that could be deemed or attributed as a scientific process of the water cycle. There are passages in the Bible written hundreds of years before the Quran that contain more detailed and accurate information about the water cycle than the Quran. However, Jewish and Christian apologists do not feel the need to flood the internet with the claim that the Bible is a scientific book or that this is proof of their religion's divinity. By around 500 BC, Greek scholars were already speculating that much of the water in rivers can be attributed to rain and had a good understanding of the water cycle. Ancient Hindu and Chinese civilizations knew and also contributed to the area of hydrology and the water cycle in more detail than the Quran. Civilizations such as the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians, due to the knowledge of hydrology and the water cycle, built the world's first irrigation systems thousands of years before the arrival of Islam.